I am really, really good at putting my foot in my mouth. It's an expression basically to say that saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Especially when I was younger, I would always manage somehow, some way to say something that was either inappropriate or just a little bit cringy. And I was lucky enough that the people who were around me kind of dismissed it and were understanding, and they empathized, and they were a little bit forgiving of my silliness. But one of the earliest memories I have of this was actually when I was in my early 20s. I took a service trip to Peru, and I worked in a very rural area at a boarding school, just doing kind of maintenance, a little bit of language and cultural exchange, but really just working with and keeping company with, sharing space with the students, the young children who were at that school. And I remember on my first night there, the whole trip was organized by a international NGO, and I was actually the only one on that service trip, so it was just me and the coordinator, and we went out and had some pizza and just kind of got to know one another. And he had shared with me that his partner had taken her life a few months prior to his trip. And so he was kind of semi-permanently based there in Peru. And of course, it was it was a heartbreaking story to hear. And, I was very understanding and expressed my sorrow along with him. And then we talked about other things for a little while, and he eventually asked why I had chosen to do this trip. Why did I want to be in Peru and actually doing this service trip? And of course, me being really good at putting my foot in my mouth said, oh yeah, well, you have to do these sorts of things in life if you get the opportunity, because if you don't, you just end up killing yourself, which of course was the most inappropriate, cringy thing I could possibly have said. And he was very kind about it. He just kind of nodded and changed the subject. And so I've always kind of struggled with this sort of issue, this kind of putting my foot in my mouth, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, or just saying something that, is a little bit cringy or mildly inappropriate. In a working environment, this can be a real challenge when we just deal with this issue of communication in general. I work in a very international environment, and so I work with people whose first languages, and I say languages on purpose, might be anything but English. My first language is English, so that's the language I would consider my most fluent language. And so we often experience kind of communication barriers or just inconsistencies or little things that are funny, and we just laugh it off and move on. But I've also seen people be very critical of some of my colleagues who don't have English as their first language. Critical in the sense that, they were judging the character of the person by how well they spoke English. And I think this is really, really problematic and really just makes for a difficult working environment when you experience that sort of judgment. In another area I've been thinking about in terms of communication, was brought up to me by a colleague of mine in regards to the wearing masks in the face of this pandemic with COVID-19. And she is hard of hearing. She has a cochlear implant. And what she told me was that the masks make it very difficult for her to communicate with people because they cover the mouth. And she uses lip reading in addition to being able to partially hear what the person is saying. And so this is just really, really problematic, and something I didn't really think on or reflect about until she brought it up. And that is that we have this issue of this pandemic who's killing millions of people around the world. We need to protect ourselves. We need to protect the safety of others, and wearing a mask is one way of doing that. But in doing so, we're creating a barrier for communication with people who are deaf and hard of hearing, who may use lip reading as a primary means of understanding what somebody is saying. So then that kind of entered my consciousness recently, and I started reflecting on this issue of communication, and that really the way communication kind of works in society is that it's a spectrum, like almost everything. There's not being able to communicate and not being able to communicate, but there's kind of a huge spectrum of ways in which we communicate. And really the key criteria here is that you can get your point across, that you can make yourself understood to the other person. And so it doesn't matter if you don't have English as your first language, and even if your English isn't perfect or your grammar's not perfect, the point here is, can you communicate? Can you get your point across? And so whenever I grade my students on their assignments, I know most of them are not English speakers as their first language. I tell them, don't worry about grammar, don't worry about spelling or punctuation. If you get your point across, then I will understand. And you can get your point across in written text, you can get your point across with visualizations, diagrams, figures, charts, and equally I will evaluate what you're doing in those terms, on your own terms, and not on some kind of predefined measure of, oh, you have excellent English or you have poor English or anything in between. That's not the point. The point is communication and being able to communicate here. And so since this exists, communication exists on a spectrum, I think it's really important for us to reflect on these issues of barriers to communication, whether that's kind of prejudice or stigma in relation to someone who may not speak English as a native speaker, or if it's like a literal barrier that prevents somebody from understanding what somebody else is saying, like a mask for someone who is a lip reader. And if you're someone who struggles with communication, either in the way I presented myself or in one of these other ways where people might be judging you, or people might just not be might not understand them because of a physical barrier, because of an actual barrier, then the best thing I can offer, the best advice that I can offer is just don't blame yourself. Don't feel inhibited by this issue, because if you are inhibited by somebody else's prejudice, then you're holding yourself back. You're holding back the value that you can contribute to the world, and in that case, the prejudice is winning. So move past that and be okay with the fact that your English isn't going to be perfect. And if you're someone who experiences a barrier, like I described with a mask, take a stand that we need to have clear masks. And we need to have as many clear masks out there as possible. And really, manufacturers shouldn't be creating masks that aren't clear, because then there's the problem of communication with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So we need to be able to have some foresight, some forethought into these issues, and make sure that we're enabling everybody to communicate, and that we're kind of not coming at communication from a point of judgment, but a point of understanding and empathy, and trying to create common understanding and mutual understanding and trust.